I worked on the technical side on the business. Why do I have to be concerned with talking to people? That's the question I that's the question I asked myself. And I worked for a company that didn't even have a sales team. They figured that would be the sales job. But here I was asking myself this question. The first job that I had working in just working basically was as a research associate, and I worked for a small medical device company just outside of Boston. And a lot of my job was working inside of a lab, doing experiments, writing up protocols and reports, and passing off anything that I generated to my boss. And he'd be the one that was responsible for disseminating that to higher ups, customers, or whoever, other stakeholders. And I certainly didn't mind that arrangement. It wasn't until I started my second job working as a product development engineer at a larger medical device company did speaking even become something that I had to concern myself with. Although I will say that when I took the job, I didn't know that would be the case. I thought the job would be very similar to what I had been doing working as a research associate. And for the first few months, it was. I worked in the lab, generating or doing experiments, generating reports, protocols, writing them up, passing them along. A few months after starting that job, my boss called me into his office and told me that I was going to be a project lead. Well, what's a project lead? Essentially, a project lead is a project manager without the title or the salary. Basically, one of the jobs that I would have to do in addition to my product development responsibilities was present my project status in front of management on a monthly basis. When I say management, I'm talking CEO, CTO, CMO, COO, C fill in the blanco, all the C's in a room watching me and another project leads present on project status. And let me tell you, those first two presentations were, what's the best way to put it? Terrible. They were terrible. There's no other way to really get around it. I didn't know it was possible to sweat that profusely from one's body. And yet there I was doing exactly that. And you would have thought I would have gotten better after that first presentation because I knew I didn't do that well. And I knew I didn't do well because after the presentation, I got a lot of questions that I thought I had answered during the presentation. But here I was sweating profusely before, during, and now after the presentation. But I didn't get better after that first presentation. I didn't learn my lesson after the second presentation, or third, or fourth, or fifth. In fact, my project got canceled. And this happened over 15 years ago at this point. And I still think back to those times and think, maybe if I was just better at communicating the usefulness of this project to these senior management types, maybe I could have saved it. But I suppose we'll never know. It was then when that project got canceled that was my wake-up call to really think this whole communicating in front of people thing, maybe that's something I need to get better at. And so I would look for opportunities to do that. I joined Toastmasters. For those of you all that don't know about it, it's an international organization with chapters all over the world whose goal is to help people improve their speaking skills, get more comfortable and confident doing so. And I did that. Even when I left that company, I joined a Toastmasters group no matter where I was working. I looked for other opportunities to present as well. It wasn't something that I was hiding from like I did with my first job. It was definitely something that I was actively looking to do. And I definitely got better at doing so. And really, a few years after that, that's when I discovered maybe this is something that I can help other technical people with. And that's where the whole idea of Teach the Geek came from. So I've spoken about me already. I mentioned that I worked as a product development engineer. I was in the medical device industry for a number of years. Then I founded Teach the Geek to help technical professionals improve their speaking, especially in front of non-technical audiences. I also have a podcast called the Teach the Geek podcast, in which I interview people with technical backgrounds about their public speaking journeys. It all started with my own struggles, but then learning what other technical people did to improve their speaking skills has been quite instructive to me as well. And I also have a YouTube channel, also called Teach the Geek, in which I offer tips on getting better at giving presentations, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And then I also have a blog on my teachthegeek.com website. So you see this title and you see this slide, you're probably wondering what is this all about? Is it going into a joke? Not exactly. So this actually happened. Let's see, last summer, I attended a technical conference. So the majority of people there were engineers. All the people that are in the audience listening to presentations, engineers. One of the presentations was given by a business development person. And I listened intently to what he had to say. After the presentation, during the Q&A part, he got a whole lot of technical questions that he simply could not answer. I felt really bad for him because question after question, he seemed to become more flustered. Luckily, there were two engineers from his company who were in the audience, and the room was small enough for them to actually answer the questions from their seats. And it just got me thinking, why didn't one of them give the presentation? It would have made sense. I mentioned it was a technical conference. It was mostly technical people in the audience. Surely they're going to have some technical questions to ask. So why wouldn't the technical person be the one giving the presentation and then answer those technical questions? Perhaps they weren't comfortable or confident to give the presentation, and that responsibility then fell to that business development person. But wouldn't it be so much better if us technical people could be the people actually presenting the technical information? We know it the best. And why wouldn't that? And that just makes more sense for us to be those people as opposed to somebody else. It's easier for us to gain those speaking skills than for a non-technical person to learn, I guess, a modicum of what we know to then give a presentation and then have to answer technical questions from technical people. When it comes to what I actually figured Teach the Geek could be, I had to think about what do technical people need to know when it comes to giving presentations that would be any different than a non-technical person. And it took me some time to really figure that out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that giving a technical presentation can be so different than giving any other kind of presentation. There's a whole lot of data that you want to go through and show to people, but you also have to think that these people don't have as much technical expertise as I do. So how can I put it in such a way that they can understand? With the Teach the Geek to Speak process, that all came from the course that I ultimately developed for technical people to improve their speaking skills. And as it shows there, it's called Teach the Geek to Speak. The first iteration of the course was me sitting at my dining room table in poor lighting, speaking to my camera phone, just speaking extemporaneously on what I thought technical people can do to improve their speaking skills. Luckily, that course never saw the light of day because I sent it to an acquaintance and she said that you can't put this out. This is terrible. It's hard to follow. You're just talking all over the place and we can barely see you. The lighting's terrible. And I took her, and then one other thing she also said is there's no process to it. And which actually was a bit embarrassing on my part, considering the fact that I worked in medical devices. And to work in medical devices, you have to follow a process to develop a medical device. So here I am in my regular job following a process, and then I develop something for technical people, and I don't follow a process. Bit of egg on my face there. But I took the hint, and I developed a process for technical people to practice and deliver any presentation they have to give. And it starts with audience analysis. Remember when I said I used to give presentations in front of management? The overwhelming majority of them were not technical. And yet here I was using a whole lot of technical jargon that I understood, passing off a bunch of data that I understood, just assuming that they'll understand. Well, that wasn't the case. And I knew it wasn't the case because I said earlier, I'd often get questions that I thought I had answered during the presentation. What I needed to do, and what I do now, is figure out the people in the audience. Who are these people and what do I think they know? And if I don't think they're at the same level of expertise as I am, well, I'm going to do a whole lot more. I'm going to put a lot more effort into using words that perhaps they'll understand or using analogies, just making it simpler for them to understand what I'm talking about. In fact, when I was giving presentations in front of management, after my presentation got canceled, the subsequent ones, what I would do is I would go to the administrative assistants, because oftentimes the senior management, they're difficult to get time with. They're busy people. But if I were to go to their admins, ask them what type of information would I need to have in my presentation to make it interesting or useful to your boss. They were very insightful, give me great feedback, and then I'd make sure that I'd have that information in the presentation. So maybe I wouldn't get as many questions after the presentation, or at least different questions. And then another part of the process has to do with timing. When I first started giving presentations, I had 15 minutes to give them. And I didn't really think about the 15 minutes. I just talked as long as I spoke. And there were often times when I would go over time. But now with this process, it's really important to time your presentations to make sure that you finish within time. I mentioned that conference that I went to last summer, and there were other presentations given besides the one by that business development person, and many of them went over time. And when one presentation goes over time, you think the subsequent presentation will shorten their amount of time to get the agenda back aligned? No, that's not what happened. They go over time too. And basically the whole agenda gets skewed. And then people are mad because lunch is starting late. And I was one of those people. So when it comes to timing your presentations, I'm a big fan of doing so while practicing, but I'm also a big fan of adding in a buffer. So for instance, if you have 15 minutes to present, I'd say practice so that you finish within 13 and a half. Because now you have a minute and a half to 2 minutes to play around with on the day of the presentation. Inevitably, you may say something that perhaps you didn't practice, or you may have less time than you thought you'd have. And in that instance, you're still able to finish within time. This definitely helps, especially when you present at conferences. If someone before you goes over time, at least you'll still be able to finish within time, and you won't be the reason the whole agenda gets off kilter. When I talk about speech structure, I'm talking about making sure that you have a call to action. What do you want people to take away from this presentation? Figure out what that is first, and then work backwards. What kind of points do you need to make that will naturally lead to that call to action? What introduction do you need to make that will lead to those points, which will lead to the call to action? It's a really helpful way to look at it, because what it does is it eliminates anything extra that you thought you would have added to the presentation. It helps to streamline it so that you're not adding just fluffy stuff. You're making sure that anything that's in there, it needs to be in there because it naturally leads to something. When I talk about a questionnaire, I'm talking about getting feedback from other people. I mentioned that I was a member of Toastmasters, and Toastmasters is really big on getting feedback. What I will say about feedback is you need to take it with a grain of salt. I mean, there were instances when I was in Toastmasters when I was told one thing by one person and told something else by another person about the same presentation. Then you have to run it through your filter to see what makes sense to you and then go forward with that. When it comes to giving technical presentations in front of non-technical people, some questions that you may want to ask them is, was this presentation understandable? Was this presentation relevant? Was this presentation effective? Those types of questions, really to help yourself make sure that whatever you presented, they got what you wanted them to get from the presentation. And then especially when it comes to that relevancy part, you want to make sure that the presentation was useful to them in the sense that this is something that they needed to know, as opposed to, well, not. So those are some questions I highly suggest using when it comes to the questionnaire. Fillers. Fillers are words that we may use in our regular language, but maybe you should try to minimize in our presentations. Words like so, like. These words can be rather distracting to people. And not only that, but if we use them too often, people may think that we don't know our topic as well as we do. And the idea of minimizing fillers actually was made more concrete to me after a conversation with my mother. I mentioned that I have a podcast, and she listened to one of my episodes. She called me after listening to it, well, she called me after starting to listen to it, I should say. She said that she got through maybe about 5 minutes, and my episodes are typically 30 minutes. After 5 minutes, she couldn't listen anymore. The reason? The guest that I had said so many times, she got frustrated and just stopped listening. It made me think, well, maybe I should do some better editing. But it also made me think this whole idea of minimizing filler words, that's something that we should try to do. So I'm a big fan of doing that to make sure that people like my mother listen. And then when I talk about personal inventory, I'm talking about what you think you did well in your presentation, what you think you need to improve in your presentation. The questionnaire is about the feedback of others, but what feedback do you have for yourself? That's just as important, in my opinion. So that essentially is the Teach the Geek to Speak process. I use it myself, and I suggest other technical people use it as well for their presentations. And once you have this process, it's just rinse and repeat. You don't have to figure out what to do for every other presentation you have to give. Here's a example of a timing practice worksheet that actually appears in the Teach the Geek to Speak workbook that I created. And as you can see here, you can make sure that you practice to a certain time, and then you see what your actual time is. How were you under that practice time? Were you over that practice time? And you can keep track of that type of thing to make sure that you're falling within time. Here's an example of the speech structure worksheet. At the bottom, you'll see that call to action part that I mentioned before. And then up top, you'll see the various the points that you can make. And once you have this filled out, then you basically have your skeleton of what your presentation is going to be. And you can flesh it out with the various data and the stories that explain the data, just all the content that will go into your presentation. Here's the bare bones of the presentation. But it really helps in putting it together. And here's an example of an audience questionnaire that also appears in the workbook. And as I mentioned, other questions you can ask is, was this presentation understandable? Was this presentation effective? Was this presentation relevant? I mean, those types of questions to help. And one other tip that I have, and I just thought of it just now, I actually do this, is when you're giving a presentation, you could go up to people afterwards, people you trust, and you can ask them, what was this presentation about? And see if they can answer it. We'll see what their answer is and see if it matches what you think it should be, because communication is interesting. We have our intent as the presenter, and then the people listening have their interpretation of what we're saying. And we want to make sure that the gap between those two is as small as possible. And if you keep track of that, well, then now you know, okay, I'm doing a good enough job of making sure that what I intend on communicating, people are actually taking in, and they're not getting confused. Here's an example of a filler word tracker worksheet where you can write down the filler words that people use or that you use as the presenter and how many times you use them. We use way more of them than we think we do. In fact, I think back to a client that I had, James or Jim. Jim sent me a video of a presentation he did, a 40-minute presentation. In 40 minutes, Jim said 100 times. And I knew he said 100 times because I counted them. This was before any of those AI type of apps or platforms that could do all the counting for you. I certainly would have ran it through that instead of going through it all myself. But I was able to tell him, 1 minute 30, at 8 minutes 39, 10 minutes 2, there's a lot of ums. And at least though he knows, so that he knows what that baseline is. For my next 40-minute presentation, let me try to beat 100 ums. And he sent me a subsequent presentation after that. And instead of 100 ums, there were 90 ums. So he's getting better. My mom would approve. So now I'd like to get into some questions that I often get when it comes to giving presentations in front of others, and some answers that I've come up with just based on what I've learned throughout my time based on even the answers or the interviews that I do on my podcast as well. People that I've interviewed offer some really excellent insights into getting better presentations too. And hopefully you'll find them insightful as well. So here's the first question. How can I make a presentation more engaging? How many presentations have you gone to or technical in nature where you had somebody reading a screen and they weren't looking at anybody, and you're in the audience, you're looking around, you're figuring out what you're going to have for lunch. You're seeing other people on their phones, you're seeing other people fall asleep. I mean, I can't just be me. I suspect that's other people as well. So what can we do to change that? Well, here are some answers. One of them is starting with a story, then going to a question, or starting with a question and going to a story. I don't know if you noticed this, but at the beginning of this presentation, I started with a question. And if you remember, that question is, why do I have to be concerned with improving its speaking? I'm a technical person. And then I told the story of me working at my first job and my second job and having to give presentations in front of management. So hopefully you all found that to be engaging, but I certainly could have flipped it and started with the story of me working my first job and second job, and then get into that question is, why do I have to get better at speaking? I'm a technical person, and then I could have started the presentation from there. Either way works, but I'm a big fan of this format as opposed to just starting off with, hi everybody, my name is Neil Thompson. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for being here. You could have been anywhere else, but you chose to be here. How many presentations have I sat through, and perhaps you've sat through, where people start that way, and you think to yourself, well, you already were introduced by the person that came before you, so you really don't need to introduce yourself again. I know your name, and then yes, in fact, I have to be here. It's part of my job. I'm here at this conference, so you don't have to thank me for being in the audience too. It just seems like wasted effort. You could just kind of get into something that's more meaty, more useful. And that's why I suggest the story question format or the question story format. And I actually did a video on my YouTube channel where I talk about how we can be more engaging. Oh, one thing I should have mentioned. There's going to be a number of links on some of these slides. If you're thinking you need to take pictures of these slides for future use, you don't need to. At the end of the presentation, I give a way where you can where I can send you the slides, so you can just listen and reflect on what I'm talking about. See if it makes sense. You know, I mean, how do I structure a presentation? I went through that briefly, but just to reiterate, that whole call to action, really important, because now this is what the basis of your presentation is going to be, and anything that you add to it has to fall in line with, does this add to that call to action? I mean, with this presentation, my call to action in my mind, I hope that people want to stay in touch. So what do I have to offer them that will make them want to stay in touch? Well, insights perhaps that they hadn't thought of before. That's the goal. And if I achieve that, then mission accomplished. And if not, well, back to the drawing board, I suppose. And I did a whole video on the importance of structuring a presentation as opposed to just getting up there and just speaking off the top of the head. In fact, funny when I think about this now, that same guest that I had who bothered my mother with all his ums, he used to give me a hard time over the fact that I would structure my presentations and practice them. He was way more of an extemporaneous speaker, and it showed, because he would start his presentations with, you could be in so many places, but you chose to be here. Thank you so much. And I just remember thinking to myself, man, you wasting precious time. And this is, and that's time that you could be spending imparting insights that I didn't know already. I know I could have been somewhere else. And I know your name already because I saw it in the agenda book. So tell me something I don't know. What about the slides? How should they look? Well, here are some suggestions. I don't know if you noticed from my slides, but they've been fairly clean, trying to minimize the amount of text. And what that does is it eliminates the option for the presenter to just read the slides. There's been so many instances where I've been at these technical conferences and you don't even know what the person's face looks like really, because all you see is the top of their head, because all they're doing is reading their slides. And that's not a great way to engage people, and when people stop listening, and then they won't take in what you had to say, and basically it was a waste of time for everybody. So I'm a big fan of having as few words on the slides as possible. It eliminates the option for the presenter to read, but it also eliminates the option of the audience to read, because when they're reading, they're not listening. And ultimately, we want to be engaged with public speaking, not public reading. I suspect that most, if not all, the people in the audience can read. Visuals. I'm a big fan of having visuals on slides. They speak 1,000 words and you can't read them. At some point, you're going to start thinking about what this person is saying as opposed to reading. What I will say about visuals is you want to try to make sure that you have this, you don't want to crowd a slide with visuals, because now people are distracted. Which visual am I supposed to be looking at any given time? You want to make it as clear as possible as to what people should be paying attention to at all times. Fonts, people try to get cute with the font sometimes, and especially if you're standing at the back of the room or seated at the back of the room, it's difficult, maybe difficult to read. So try to make sure to use fonts that are clear, especially the people in the back. When I talk about titles, this is something that I think could potentially be something that you didn't know already. We'll see. There have been so many instances where I've been in a presentation listening, or you're listening to someone give a presentation, and there may be no title to their slide or to their visuals, either whether it be a table or a graph or a chart, or the title may be very long, and even you have to think really hard as to what it means. When I say useful title, I'm saying with your visuals, give it a title that conveys what you want the audience to take away from that visual. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to know, why am I looking at this visual? Why is it important to me? And here's an example of that. More resources for product 5. That's what you're supposed to get away from this pie chart. You could look at products 1, 2, 3, and 4, but what I, as the presenter, want you to focus on and retain product 5. More resources for that. We could ask about those other products, but product 5, focus. And when you do that, I think people are more likely to do just that. You're making it easier for them to know, what am I taking away from this? Why am I looking at this with this pie chart? I could be doing other things. You could have added something else. Now, mixed audiences can be difficult because you have the people who are experts, you have the people who are newbies. How do you give a presentation that appeals to both groups? And I've gotten this question before, and after some thought and listening to the answers from other people that I've interviewed on my podcast, well, there are some answers. If at all possible, you can try to get a breakdown of the audience by percentage. How many people in this audience are going to be experts? How many people are going to be newbies? If it skews more newbies, well, I suggest to trying to simplify your presentation as best you can to make sure that they listen. And if it's experts, well, then maybe you can use all that technical jargon, because you don't want it to be so simple, because they're thinking, we're experts. Why are you presenting all this simple information? We want to know more in-depth information. Although when I do say that, knowing what that percentage is, between the novices and the experts, I think something else that you should take into account is what decision makers are in the audience. And if there's decision makers, whether they're novices or newbies, you want to cater to them, because oftentimes they're the people who are going to be we're going to be deciding. For instance, when I had to give presentations in front of management, there could have been other technical people in the audience, but if the decision maker is the CEO and he's non-technical, well, this presentation better appeal to this person, appeal to that CEO. And if not, well, then you might have some problems, but you certainly don't want to be in that situation. And another thing that I think about when it comes to giving presentations in mixed audiences is this whole idea of word choice. So for instance, if you're speaking to a group of technical experts, words that you can use to make sure that what they're about to hear is something they want to hear or should hear or need to hear is to go more in depth. If you say to go more in depth, the technical people their ears are gonna perk up. Okay, this person's gonna get into something more meaty. Let me pay attention. But if you're speaking to a audience that skews more novice, words that you could use could be to simplify. Now their ears are gonna perk up. Okay, I can handle simple. This whole technical presenting stuff. Yeah, I mean, I have to be here, and this is information that is useful to me. But if you're going to present it in a simplified way, and you've now indicated to me that you're going to speak about it in a more simplified way, well, now I'm definitely going to pay attention to see what I can take away from it. And I did a video on this on my YouTube channel as well. This is one that I've struggled with, and to an extent still continue to struggle with in some sense, is how do you answer questions you don't know the answer to? I actually wrote an article on this for TD magazine. It's the magazine of the Association for Talent Development. The article was about reasons in which technical people may shy away from giving presentations. And one of the reasons I offered in the article was they don't want to be in a position where they're having to answer questions that they may not know the answer to, because they don't want to be seen as less of the expert that they believe or are seen to be. So how can we get around this crutch that perhaps some of us have? In some instances, we may just not understand the question that's being asked. So repeating the question back in our own words to the person asking it can be really helpful in making sure that we are answering the question that is meant to be asked. I mean, I mentioned earlier this gap between the receiver and the sender of information, making sure that it's as small as possible. Well, this is a way to do that. And repeating the question back to the question asker until you get a positive response from them saying, yes, that's the question I'm asking. Well, then I think that's a good use of time. So now, what if you, after figuring that out, okay, you know the question that's being asked, it's been confirmed by the asker, and you still don't know? We have to become comfortable saying, I don't know. I think a lot of us, as I mentioned, as technical people, we see ourselves as these subject matter experts, and we're expected to know, and we expect ourselves to know. And when we don't know, we think we're failing in our role, but no one is all knowing. So we need to become more comfortable with I don't know, but it doesn't stop there with just I don't know. It has to be I don't know and I will find out. Especially if you're talking to the senior level management people. I don't know isn't going to cut it because you're going to see them again likely. These aren't people that you're presenting to at a conference that perhaps you'll never run into again. So definitely finding out that information is going to be helpful when speaking to people you'll see again. And here is a blog post that I wrote on this topic. It's on my website.
Hi, Neil. We just had a quick chat in the question in the chat. Just wondering, would they be able to answer with "I wish I knew" or "Let's discover"?
I wish I knew. Well, if you were to say I wish I knew, and at some point the wish will be granted because I will know because I'll find out the answer, then sure. I see that as being an acceptable answer. And let's discover, with let's discover, you're inviting them to help you find the solution. And certainly if that's appropriate, that's the case. But I suspect that if you're seen as that subject matter expert and the person asking you is not, then they may think you're the one that's supposed to have that answer, not me. And if that's the case, well, then I don't know, but I will find out seems to be the more appropriate answer. But I certainly can see either of those answers being appropriate depending on the context. All right, next question. How do I address getting feedback? I mentioned feedback earlier, so what do I have to say about this now? Have you ever gotten unsolicited feedback from someone whose opinion you didn't respect? Or is that just me? You know, in Toastmasters, Toastmasters is funny. Toastmasters is a great opportunity. It offers an excellent forum to improve with your speaking skills. And as I mentioned, in Toastmasters, you also get the opportunity to get feedback from others. And in most instances, you're open to it, but in other times, you're not really. In fact, I remember this instance in which a professional speaker was giving a presentation. And when she got off the stage, someone came up to her and said, "Can I offer you some advice?" And you know what she said? No. You know what that person, said to her? No, please. The person really wanted to get off that advice. I just remember thinking that had to have been a Toastmaster. But yeah, you really definitely need to know whether the person that you want to offer advice to is even open to hearing the advice in the first place. And if not, then you might want to just give it to yourself. Last year, I learned more about DISC. It's an assessment tool to help people figure out what personality styles people have. And once I learned about it, it made so much more make sense to me. Because oftentimes I'd hear people say certain things and I think, well, that doesn't make sense to me at all. But now I know why. It's because of my personality type. So the D stands for dominant, the I stands for influence, the S stands for steadfastness, and the C stands for conscientiousness. And these are basically the four personality types, I suppose, that this DISC assessment talks about. As technical people, I think a lot of us tend to be more C's, conscientiousness. If you're giving us advice or feedback, we want to know where this feedback is coming from. We want more details as to what this feedback is, what you exactly you think we need to get better at. And I think if you were to figure out what personality type that you're speaking to, I think that could be really helpful in even tailoring the type of feedback that you give. For a D person, they're more direct to the point, no fluff. With the I person, you better add the fluff. They don't like that directed to the point, they might get offended. So it all depends. And I suppose that has to come with some trial and error, figuring out how people want to take in how people want to accept the feedback. I'm also a big fan of ongoing and specific, especially if you're giving presentations on a regular basis at work. Your subsequent presentations can only get better as you get that feedback. As the questions that I asked before. Was the presentation understandable? Was the presentation relevant? Was the presentation effective? Time after time, with subsequent presentations, if you're getting better answers to those questions, yes, it was understandable. Or, this part of the presentation I didn't understand as well. Well, now at least, for your subsequent presentations, you can get better. Practice makes progress after all. And I wrote a blog post on this subject as well. A number of months ago, I did a poll on LinkedIn and I asked the question, what's the biggest challenge that technical people have with giving presentations? And this question, or this answer, essentially was number one, balancing technical depth and clarity. As a subject matter expert, we have all this technical expertise and we want to impart it to people. We want to make it as clear as possible, especially if we're talking to a non-technical audience that doesn't have the same level of expertise as we do. So how do we go about balancing the two? Explanations and analogies, using commonly used words when presenting. So helpful. There's been so many instances where I will be in the audience and listen to someone use a whole bunch of jargon that of course they understand. They understand it perfectly. I don't understand it at all. And I'm looking around and I don't see anybody else looking like they don't know what's going on. So you definitely don't, and then you don't want to be that person asking the question after the presentation. Although when I was giving presentations, those senior management types, they had no problem asking me those questions after the presentation. Who's going to tell them anything? Oh, the CEO's worried about looking bad? You can fire all of us. He don't care. So definitely using more commonly used words, really helpful analogies, explanations, and actually I have an example on the next slide on how we can go about that. I mentioned visuals and how that can be really helpful in speaking 1,000 words as opposed to having a whole bunch of words on the screen. More slides if necessary. I mean, I live here in the San Diego area, and I attend a number of pitch competitions. A lot of technical founders are the ones giving these pitches, and in so many instances, the people in the audience are non-technical, so it's really important for them to lessen the amount of jargon, to use those analogies, to use those explanations, to use more commonly used words. Every now and then, they're going to be technical people in the audience, though, and they're going to want more in-depth information. And what I saw really helpful is these people oftentimes would have slides that weren't part of their presentation, but they had them ready in the event that there were more technical type questions. And they can always refer to those slides if necessary. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier the importance of getting feedback. After presentations, you can ask people, how well did I do in balancing this technical depth and clarity? Was the presentation understandable? And based on those answers, well, then you know what you can do to better give subsequent presentations. And I did a blog post on this topic as well. So here's that slide I was talking about. I mentioned that I worked in medical devices. More specifically, I worked in spinal implants, and more specifically than that, I worked in orthobiologics. What is orthobiologics, you may ask? I suspect that some, if not all, most of you may have no clue. And funny enough, in the company that I worked in, a lot of the people in the company had no clue what orthobiologics is. In fact, the group that I worked for, it was a new group. So everyone in that group were these experts, and everyone outside the group were non-experts. So those presentations at first were interesting at best. But ultimately, when I talk about orthobiologics, I'm talking about what we can use to create these spinal implants. Spinal implants can be made out of ceramic. They can be made out of metal, but they can also be made out of cadaver bone. So for those of you all who are organ donors, your bones may well be used to develop spinal implants for people still living. So thank you for being organ donors. So you see those two terms on the screen, osteoblast and osteoclast. If I were giving a presentation back when I worked in orthobiologics to a group of non-orthobiologics experts, and I kept using those terms, they'd have no clue. And you know how I know they'd have no clue? Because this happened. I gave presentations continuously using these terms, and then I get questions afterwards. What's an osteoblast again? What's an osteoclast? Essentially, what you see there is what they are. An osteoblast is a bone-forming cell, and an osteoclast is a bone-eating cell. A bit of a biology lesson. How your bones work is that the osteoblasts are continuously laying down these new bone, and then the osteoclasts are eating away old bone. It's a process that continues on as we age, but it does, the bone forming process does slow down, especially when we become senior citizens. A lot more bone eating happens, which is why people who are older tend to have more brittle bones. So there's your biology lesson for the day. You're welcome. So essentially, if I were to use bone forming cell and bone eating cell as opposed to osteoblast and osteoclast, well, those terms are more understandable. They're more commonly used words than osteoblast and osteoclast. At least if I were to set it up that way. If I were to use osteoblast and osteoclast elsewhere or later on in the presentation, the people at least know what those words mean because I explained them early on in the presentation. Nerves. How do you manage nerves? I got some interesting answers for that based on my podcast guests. First one, the first couple are mine. The next two actually aren't. The next three aren't. So the first two, light physical activity, knee bends, walking around, light, push-ups even on your knees. Maybe not on your, maybe not off your knees. Don't want to sweat too much, but using light physical activity really helps in dissipating that nervous energy. I do it all the time. And then when it comes to the second one, again, that's mine, deep breathing and visualizing success. If you tell yourself you suck, you are more likely to suck than if you tell yourself you're improving. The mind goes where we tell it to go. If we're telling it, this is something that we're trying to get better at, and we're doing so by putting in the reps, by giving presentations, well, then we're more likely to do that. And then the deep breathing and closing your eyes and actually seeing yourself do that, seeing yourself hit the marks where you want to hit them, making sure that you remember all the points you want to make, hitting the call to action at the end of the presentation. All of that, we're visualizing it happening before it actually happens. Really helpful in actually making it happen. These next three are actually coming from guests on my podcast. So when it comes to the bathroom stall, it's not to use the facilities. It's to go into the bathroom, go into the stall, sit down, and relax yourself. You can then even do the deep breathing and visualization I mentioned in that second bullet. But basically, going to the bathroom helps to get away from the hustle and bustle of what's going on in the presentation room. Really helps to calm your nerves. Gripping something. This only works for virtual presentations. If you were to do something like this in an in-person presentation, people might think you're weird. But when it comes to virtual, it's very easy to do. In fact, I do it all the time. And I'm doing it right now. With my grip ball. I got a number of them. I don't want to hear. It really helps to dissipate that nervous energy as well. And this last one, toe wiggling, this was an interesting one. So one of my guests said she wiggles her toes. And she says that it helps in the sense that instead of thinking about the fact that she's nervous, she's thinking about the toe wiggling. Now, I wouldn't suggest doing this in open toe shoes, but other than that, I think it's really cool and something certainly to try. And I wrote a piece on this for Inc. magazine on these various ways to manage your nerves giving presentations. What about them filler words? I mentioned we want to keep my mother happy. How do we keep my mother happy? By minimizing those filler words. Well, getting an audio or video of your presentations helps. I know it's difficult to hear back a presentation. Some of us may not even like the sound of our own voices on recording, but it's really instructive to listen to the presentation and take stock of all the filler words that we use. And as I said earlier, we use way more of them than we think we do. Keeping track is so important because, as I mentioned with Jim didn't know that he used 100 ums in a 40-minute presentation. Once I was able to show it to him line by line in a spreadsheet, well, now it's obvious. It can't be ignored. And then you at least have a baseline to work from. What can I do to minimize that number? I want to go less than 100 next time. Natural pausing. When you feel the need to use a filler word, pause instead. I find that people are less bothered by pausing than they are by filler words. At least that's what my mom said. And then there's this app called Udly.ai. You can use it to record yourself giving presentations, and then it gives you a breakdown of all the filler words you used. And I would have used this if I had it at the time that I was evaluating Jim's presentations. It certainly would be a lot easier. So Udly.ai. And I did a video on my YouTube channel answering this question. Getting experience speaking. How do we get it? Don't be like me initially and shy away from it like I did with my first job. I mentioned Toastmasters earlier, so I won't get more into that. Lunch and learns. Be that person that suggests to the company, let's do lunch and learns. People may want to know about what we work on as technical people within the organization, especially for companies that are product driven. It's actually in everyone's best interest to learn more about the roles or learn more about what the technical people are up to. Do that and see how your presentation skills improve, because now you're doing it on a regular basis. Podcast guesting, I think, is something that people don't think about when it comes to improving their speaking skills, but something I definitely suggest. Getting on podcast and learning how to tell stories, how to speak off the cuff, how to be more comfortable speaking to somebody, having these conversations about a topic that you may know of, but you don't know the questions that are coming. Really helpful when it comes to actually getting up in front of people on a stage. It helps to calm your nerves. It helps you become more comfortable in front of people and communicating. Being a podcast guest, highly recommended. And I did a whole video offering these tips on my YouTube channel. So what else do I got to say? Anything else? Yes. The importance of storytelling. I touched on it briefly. So often us technical people don't understand the importance of telling stories with our presentations. We just think they want the data, right? No, especially if you're speaking in front of a non-technical audience, you know how hard it is to take in just that data. It's difficult, and I suspect that we know this too, especially if we've been in the audience and we were listening to someone speak on a topic that we're not experts in. Just data dumping on us. Yeah, I'm gonna go look on my phone, see what's going on, see what I'm gonna have for lunch that day. The importance of storytelling, couching that data within the story, highly important, highly effective. the idea of a callback. Very popular in stand-up comedy, but I find it helpful in presentations as well. What a callback is referring to something that you said earlier in the presentation. It ties a nice bow around the presentation, and it also shows that you took some time to really figure out how to give this presentation. It's very difficult to do a callback on the fly. You kind of have to practice it, unless you're just better than I am, I suppose. But yeah, it's really helpful. When I talk about empathy, what am I talking about when I say empathy? I think a lot of us technical experts, we think that people just should know what we know already, but we didn't always know what we know. We weren't always technical experts. At one point, we were lay people. We went to school, got a technical degree probably, then took on this technical role, and over time, we developed this technical expertise. And then we give presentations and just assume that everything we know, other people know. But as I said, we didn't always know those things. So when we put our presentations together, we need to keep that in mind. What kind of presentation could we have taken in back when we weren't that technical person? And perhaps we should tailor our presentation to that person as opposed to the technical expert that we now are. And I did a number of videos on these various topics. What do I mean when I talk about eye contact? When I was in Toastmasters, I'd often get the advice I need to improve my eye contact. But you know what would happen when I would look people in the eyes for 3 seconds, as was expected or recommended? I forget what I was going to say. And then I'd just be stumbling. So if you're like me and you are distracted by looking people directly in the eyes, I suggest looking at their eyebrows instead. I don't find it as distracting, and people can't tell the difference, especially if you're on a stage. So take that with a grain of salt, certainly with all the other feedback that I've given, but I stand firmly behind this one. Eyebrows, not eyeballs. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my email address. If you want to check out the podcast, there is the link, and then the YouTube channel, there's the link as well. And to put a bow on everything, I hope that, I mentioned that earlier in the presentation that when I first started working, I didn't see the need in getting better as a communicator. I thought that was the job of somebody else. But hopefully at the end of this presentation, you don't think how I did back then, and you certainly see the benefit, and I presented some insights that could be useful to you.
Thank you, Neil. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, if you would like me to read them out to you.
Oh, sure. And just one other thing before you read those questions is with this slide here, if you were to scan the QR code or to click on here, you will be directed to a landing page where if you provide your email and your name, I'll send you the slides.
Thank you. The first question that we have in the chat is there any difference to work on when one delivers an online presentation versus delivering a presentation in person?
Yeah, I think the big one, when it comes to virtual presentations, especially, is where to look. It's important to look at the camera. I think a lot of times we'll look at the screen, and certainly we need to look at the screen to advance the slides. But when you're actually speaking to the slides, do your best to look at the camera as opposed to looking at the screen. That's a big one. And then I mentioned it earlier, but also with a virtual presentation, you have a bit more leeway than you would have with an in-person one. I mentioned the idea of squeezing something, gripping something, which is something it would be more difficult to do with an in-person presentation. Although I suppose if you had a lectern for an in-person one, you could squeeze the sides of it. But with a virtual one, it's way easier to squeeze something with people not even noticing it.
Thank you. Do you have any tips for public speaking situations that are less structured, speaking on a panel, for example?
So when it comes to the panels, I mentioned earlier the importance of repeating back the question. In fact, last year I was on a panel, and there was one of the panelists. I still remember this. Someone asked a question, and he immediately started answering it. And I remember thinking to myself, Well, that wasn't the question the person asked at all. Asked at all. What's this guy talking about? And so it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of repeating back the question to make sure that you understand the question that's being asked. And then when it comes to panels, it's really important to be as interesting as you possibly can be. And you have to speak more in sound bites because you only have so much time to speak. It's not like a podcast where you have typically, a half hour, maybe even an hour to have a conversation with somebody. You want to get your points out more quickly. So I suppose when it comes to personality types, those D's will probably do well in those as panelists.
Thank you. The next question is, do Mr. Neal think that teaching skills are helpful for presentation preparation? What teaching skills are key, and if volunteering as a tutor counts as...
Okay, when it comes to teaching skills, certainly, because when you're a teacher, you have to be a listener. And when an active listening, I think, can be really helpful when it comes to improving at giving presentations. Because presenting is a two-way thing, despite what we may think. You are as the communicator, as the sender, we're sending out this information and we have this intent, but then we also have to take in what we have to take into account what people are taking in from what we're saying. So I would think that a teaching skill that could be really beneficial would be the idea of being an effective listener. And as I said, being an effective listener, I think, could make you a stronger presenter. And now that I think about it even more deeply, as a tutor, I suppose you're also a learner. So as a learner, you're going to be somebody who's interested in seeing other people speak so that you can get better at it. So you are more likely to attend webinars like this. You're more likely to watch YouTube videos or read books or just taking advice from other people. So I certainly see teaching skills as being very helpful in being a better presenter.
Thank you. At this time, I do not see any more questions in the chat. We have lots of praise and thanks for the helpful tips. We have about 2 minutes left. If there was any other questions or anything like that, please feel free. If not, thank you, Neal, so much. This was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I knew that I had an hour to present, and I practiced to make sure that I finished within the hour. I followed my own advice, and I was timing myself while I was giving the presentation too. So certainly, as I said, I follow my own advice.